Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to completely strip away those comforting illusions of order we all rely on and dive headfirst into a really grim, dark fable. We're exploring the raw, downright terrifying, yet ultimately liberating essence of existential freedom. We'll be breaking down a story known as the Violet Paradox. It's a narrative that uses the incredibly stark imagery of a dying world to explore some profound Nietzschean philosophy. So if you've ever felt like the structures around you are just suffocating, or if you've ever wondered what actually happens when all the rules simply collapse, you are absolutely in the right place. Let's get right into it. We're kicking things off with a stark Nietzschean challenge. You prefer the ghost to the body, the unattainable to the ripe fruit hanging right before your eyes. This quote plunges us straight into the ashes of human psychology. It forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. Why does humanity cling so desperately to the safety of illusions instead of just facing the visceral, tangible reality of our own existence? Well, as you'll see in our fable, this avoidance of reality is the exact thing that leads a society straight into decay. Section 1. The Weight of Overripe Fruit. Okay, so this failing moral order is represented in our fable by an entire kingdom literally suffocating under its own decay. And it perfectly illustrates this dual nature. On the one side, we see what a society or, say, a fruit is supposed to be, right? Full of nourishment and sweetness. But on the flip side, we see what it has actually become, rot and vinegar. In the paradox, the text describes the fruit of this old world as overripe. Its skin is tight with rot, and that original sweetness, it's completely fermented into toxic vinegar. It's a pretty grim metaphor for an established order where perceived value has actually become dangerous and restrictive. The very thing that once fed the people is now poisoning them. Just imagine looking at this fading, crumbling ledger from the Old Kingdom. Look at the columns, golden cages, titles, and debts. The rigid laws of this old world weren't noble at all. These arbitrary titles and inescapable debts were literally nothing more than golden cages. They trapped people in a highly toxic, restrictive existence. Basically, they created a facade of order that just masked the underlying rot. People were so weighed down by all these debts and titles that they couldn't even see the cage they were living in. Section 2. The Higher Illusion. To justify its own decay, this rotting society clung desperately to false eternal ideals. The text says, "The eternal is the only symbol, a makeshift signpost we invented because we were too weak to dance with the fleeting nihilism." You see, instead of facing the void, instead of just admitting that their world was rotting from the inside out, the Old Kingdom invented these makeshift signposts. They wanted some pale, bloodless truth hiding behind a curtain, all because they were simply too weak to accept the fleeting, chaotic nature of reality. Basically, they chose the ghost over the body. Section 3. The Starfinder's Destructive Mercy. But here's the thing about rot. It cannot sustain itself forever. The catalyst for change arrives, but definitely not as some traditional loving savior. It comes as a devastating force of nature known as the Starfinder. And notice this terrifying transition he goes through. First, he begins as a cold observer, just watching the overripe fruit in a state of great silence. Then, that silence transforms him into an agent of chaos, prompting the earth to literally exhale a lethal breath. And finally, he becomes the bringer of destructive mercy. He isn't there to balance the ledger, he is there to burn it to the ground. And here is the exact moment of that annihilation. The rigid laws crumbled like parched lilies. Just sit with that imagery for a second. As the earth exhales its lethal breath, those once unbreakable titles, all those inescapable debts we saw in the ledger, they don't just slowly fade away. They crumble into dust like dried, dead flowers. The golden cages are completely and utterly destroyed. The established order doesn't reform, it dies. Section 4. A Field of Black Ash. By morning, the old world is literally nothing but a field of black ash. The survivors are plunged into pure nihilism, standing quietly among the total ruins of everything they once knew. And we really need to define nihilism in this specific context. It's the total collapse of a decaying moral order, leaving a void completely devoid of the old master's structures and false meaning. Those makeshift signposts we talked about, gone. The curtain, burnt. There is only the void. But paradoxically, within that void lies something profound, existential freedom. This is the terrifying, boundless void where a person is completely stripped of all previous identity and given the ultimate choice to just begin.
This is the haunting paradox of the Starfinder's mercy. Yes, he destroyed their entire world, but in doing so, he gave them the one single thing they lacked inside their golden cages. He gave them the terrifying freedom to begin anew. Because without the complete destruction of the rot, there could be absolutely no true freedom.
Section 5. The Violet Paradox. Emerging quietly from all that total destruction, we are presented with a massive contradiction, and it's embodied by a simple violet flower. On the one hand, mythologically speaking, the violet is deeply rooted in the story of Persephone and the underworld, so it's heavily associated with sorrow and death. It belongs to the dark. Yet, biologically, it is simultaneously the very first bloom to bravely pierce the frost of spring, which symbolizes fierce hope and new beginnings. It has this incredible dual nature. It actually requires the bitter, freezing death of winter to showcase its ultimate vitality. And that duality, that gives us the ultimate lesson of the entire fable. The ruin of the old world is the only gateway to true value. This paradox perfectly mirrors the fable's conclusion. The absolute destruction of the rotting world by the Starfinder wasn't some malicious punishment. It was the necessary ground, the fertile black ash for emerging life and true value to finally take root. You literally cannot have the spring violet without the killing frost, and you cannot have existential freedom with the ashes of nihilism.
Section 6. Dancing with Fleeting Nihilism. Now, the Starfinder doesn't stick around to be their new master. The text tells us he simply returns to his mountain, his gaze already turning toward the next dying constellation. The survivors are left completely alone to bear the weight of freedom. They are stripped of all previous titles, erased of all oppressive debts, completely freed from their golden cages. But crucially, they are left in the haunting, silent ash. They now have to carry the heavy, nihilistic weight of this newfound reality. They're forced to exist without those comfortably rigid structures that once told them exactly who to be and what to do. The silence is deafening, sure, but it is entirely theirs.
So, I'm going to leave you with this final, provocative thought to take away from our explainer today. When your own golden cages inevitably crumble, what will you do? Will you search desperately for another illusion to hide behind? Will you cling to the makeshift signposts of a rotting world? Or are you brave enough to dance with fleeting nihilism in the ash and embrace the terrifying freedom to finally begin? The choice, stripped of all titles and debts, is entirely yours. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive. I'll see you next time.